Heyo, welcome everyone to episode 88 of Today in the Scene. I'm Joe with Indie Arcade Wave, and I just want to say thank you for checking us out. If you like what we're doing here at Indie Arcade Wave, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us a ton. It just helps us continue to grow. Now, this week we're going to be bringing Adam Pratt from Arcade Heroes, as well as the owner of Arcade Galactic, back onto the show to talk about arcades, games, things like that. So we have more of an idea of what it's like from the business side. So I guess without further ado, Adam, how you doing?
Good. How are you doing, Joe?
I'm doing great. I'm glad you're able to get on here. It's always fun talking to you to kind of get your perspective, since there's not a lot of people in the industry that like have as much knowledge of the arcade scene in general, just because you run the blog, but also as an owner too. So unique
Thanks.
perspective from you.
Thanks.
I guess for anyone that doesn't know who you are, just go ahead, introduce yourself again, and let them know who you are.
Sure. I'm Adam Pratt. I'm running an arcade here. In fact, got a customer here. Sorry, how much? All right. Just running a real arcade business in Utah. I guess show you here. First customer of the day. Only keep a few games on in the mornings, just because sometimes I can be sitting around here without uh, anybody around, and that wastes electricity. And electricity has become a bit more expensive lately. But I do the blog arcadeheroes.com, and been doing that since 2007. The blog itself has been around since 2006, and it was sold to me sometime after I started writing for it, and been doing the arcade since 2008, which actually it'll be our 14th year anniversary here on June 8th. And so looking forward to that as well. But I may need to go turn some more games on right now because I've got some more people here wanting to play. So might need to pause on that really quick. But that's me in a nutshell.
Gotcha. Well, I'm glad they're coming back. I guess we'll talk about your West Valley City. That's the location that you're at right now.
Yeah.
Kind of run us through what that process was like starting that arcade.
Yeah. So way back when I was just a wee lad. I think I was 6 or 7, somewhere around there, when I visited my very first arcade, and this was like in the very late 80s, and it was for a birthday party, my friend's birthday party, and he went around the arcade. We only got a small amount of tokens, and I spent them on some games that I don't really remember. Maybe one was Ikari Warriors, but there was one game that really stood out to me, and it was called Discs of Tron. But I'd already spent my tokens, so I went around coin fishing, going into all the little coin reject slots to see if I could find any more tokens to play that one. And I think I did get a chance. I didn't really understand the game very well, but something about it really fascinated me. I mean, I grew up before that playing video games, any video game I could get my hand on. But something about the Tron game drew me in. And so sometime later, maybe a few years later, I finally got to see the movie. And that movie really stuck with me, the main character of Kevin Flynn and him running an arcade, making video games, things like that. And I guess just planted a seed where it's like, hey, I want to do that when I grow up. It'd be so cool to own and operate an arcade. And so later on, as a teenager, eventually one of the jobs that I did was working at an arcade facility. What in the business we call them FECs, or family entertainment centers, where they had a big arcade, but they had a lot of other attractions like a skating rink, mini golf, movie theater, restaurants, some rides and other stuff like that, laser tag. So I worked there for a while, and that's helped me get some experience within the business to kind of know how it ran. And but also I was always into writing, and a few years later, that's where I started just doing my own research into what was going on with the arcade industry and what was the news, because almost nobody was reporting any arcade news. Like most game magazines, those that still existed in the early 2000s, barely mentioned arcades, and then there weren't really many websites. There was one called barcade.com, which was not the same Barcade that now operates locations. and that they were the only ones that I recall, and Replay magazine and Play Meter magazine to a small degree, reporting on news to the industry. But eventually discovered the Arcade Heroes blog and started sending them stuff. And they're like, hey, why don't you write for us? And then that's where I started doing that. But wasn't long after that process that it was like I was really starting to put my focus into starting the arcade business. And so for a year or two, I think I'd been developing a business plan. And there was I think they're still around, a nonprofit organization to help people learn how to start a business. And they had mentors called score.org. And they had like some business plans, templates that you could use. And that helped me focus on what I needed to learn to really get the business off the ground. Learned some things about applying for an SBA loan, which is what I did. Also got a little help from family members who there were a couple who purchased machines and put them in, and I paid them off slowly. And after I got that SBA loan, just opened up and went from there. And so I've been doing it for 14 years. And inside this mall, I'm inside of a mall, Valley Fair Shopping Center, as they now call themselves. They don't want to call themselves a mall anymore. So we'll be here for 14 years, and we've moved in this mall 4 times, just due to reconstruction of the mall and them making it look nicer and adding more stuff. Just there has been some detriment to that, because as I speak, there is a giant FEC down the hall from me, and so a big locally owned bowling center, but from a multimillionaire who they have like 5 locations in Utah. And so when they opened, things went from going really great to not as great, and then of course the pandemic happened. But that kind of sums it all up.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, that's a lot going on, and as we know, I mean, things have been pretty crazy the last couple of years, but it seems like they're rebounding a little bit for you. Let's talk about games. Like, I'm curious, and I've had people ask in the comments and stuff as to what games make the most money. Like, what games really net you more than you pay for them by means of arcade games or even pinballs? Because I know pinballs do pretty well too.
Yeah, and on my Arcade Heroes channel, YouTube channel, I've been talking about that a little bit in recent times, as um, it's a difficult thing to get a hold of numbers in this industry, because most operators protect them harder than state secrets, and so it becomes a real pain. But I'm just pulling up some recent numbers here, like off the top of my head. I kind of already know what the types of games that are going to do well, but at least for this year, and looking at it, my top 5 games, so my best performing game right now, or this year, is The Walking Dead by Raw Thrills, a light gun game, a shooter game, basically. And then the other 4 are all racing games. And the thing that the spreadsheet I use does separate out the each individual unit, because we do track that. But let me just see here. So yeah, like what's our second place one? Where is that? Oh, Minecraft Dungeons is actually doing a little better than I thought it was. So it's actually my number 2 right now. Minecraft Dungeons Arcade by Raw Thrills, which came out last year. And then number 3 would be Maximum Tune 5DX Plus by Bandai Namco. And number 4, the other units just right behind that in earnings. And then you have Cruisin' Blast, and I have 2 units of that too, which make up 5 and 6 basically. And so racing and light gun games, those are generally what do the best in this industry. They're kind of a surefire hit. I haven't done the math on the Maximum Tune games to see how quickly they've paid themselves off, but I do recall on Cruisin' Blast, which I got, I think, 2017 or so, that paid itself off within 5.5 months. And the general thing in this business, I guess one quick tangent is I used to sell games for a time too. While I was doing this, I worked for an arcade distributor selling machines. And one question that I would often receive is, how quickly will these things pay themselves off? And of course, it's a variable. It depends on each game, but the average that most operators look for is a year to pay itself off. And of course, anything that pays itself off under that, you're super happy with. But of course, there are certain games that when they start costing above $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, as some of them do, it takes it a little bit longer to do. Yeah, so pinballs, and I also did a video about this recently, where pinball seems to depend very much on the type of business that it's in and the region where it's at. And so, like how a pinball would earn at an arcade in Chicago or in Portland, Seattle, like the West Coast or extreme West Coast, because I guess I'm kind of technically West Coast or Rocky Mountains. For some reason, in those places, pinball seems to do better, at least from what I've heard, kind of anecdotally. I was talking with an operator who runs several locations in Wisconsin, and he was telling me that he was talking to a bar operator where his average was maybe $200. Can't remember if it was a week or a month. But he gave me a few numbers on some of his pinball machines, and they were about where I see mine, where they're not that great. They don't pay themselves off in a year's time, and sometimes you only really pay them off when you sell them. Fortunately, pinball does sometimes seem to appreciate instead of depreciate in value, but of course that depends on the game. And something like Adam's Family is, I guess, unless you're accounting for inflation since 1992, you might. I think you're still coming out pretty well, but I haven't looked at Adam's Family pinball prices. But I've seen some pinball machines where, these days they're selling $10,000, $12,000 for the ones that are most desirable. Adam's Family, Twilight Zone, Junkyard, maybe. And you can probably hear some of the pinball being played right now over my mic, and so it's just pinball. It's an odd one because I like having it because the people who tend to play it know it, and that means they're more loyal. They'll come in and play it more often, but there's also this weird effect that goes on. Maybe you could call it a dichotomy, where some people that really get into pinball like it so much that they buy it, and then so they have pinball machines at their home, and when they have it at their house, they don't want to go to an arcade to play it. But then pinball has a very tough time at really bringing in new blood, so to speak, where, like in my place, I usually have quite a few families that come through, kids, teens, adults. People ask me, what's the age range that you see? And it's literally, I've seen people coming in with newborns and guys, ladies that are in their 90s. And so it really just covers everything. It's kind of, I guess, a casual mix. But for a lot of those, it's very rare that I see somebody encountering pinball for the first time and then they keep coming back to it afterwards. Now, we do get a lot of people that have never seen pinball before, don't know what it is, and particularly I do have a second location. I can't recall if I mentioned that, where it's up in Ogden, Utah, and we've been operating that since the end of 2020. And for some reason up there, it's almost daily, at least weekly, where we get somebody that comes in who is genuinely perplexed by what pinball is. They don't know how to play it, what it's all about. They see something that draws them in, such as the license, be it Star Wars or Jurassic Park or something like that. But then when they approach it, they just don't know what to do with it because it looks so complicated. And so that's one odd thing with pinball. Even though it's been around longer than video games have, there's just so many people that don't really understand what it what the point is. Like I've had customers ask me that before, like, what's the point, or how do you win this? And that, like, I've heard pinball designers talk before where they want you to feel like you are the pinball, or the pinball's the hero of the game. It's the arcade hero or the pinball hero, and they want to make the player feel like they're the ones, like they're putting themselves into the pinball. But that's a really difficult thing to get across just by the game existing, by it just simply being there. And so, whereas video games, that's a little easier to approach. If you approach a racing game, you see the steering wheel, it's a racing game, you're going to race. You see a light gun game, same thing. Joystick games can be a little different in that regard, just because there's so many different genres that you can get with a joystick, but still it's fairly easy to approach. But even though pinball, it doesn't have complicated controls, it's just the rest of the game. A lot of people just don't understand that it's basically baseball, where you're, instead of trying to knock it out of the park, you're knocking it into targets instead. And so that's sometimes the analogy that I'll use to people when they ask, what is this thing here? And I'll say, well, think of baseball, but you got two bats and you're hitting the ball into targets to get as many points as you can.
That definitely makes sense. I've never thought of it like baseball. That's a pretty good analogy for kind of the way that it works. And I guess another question I've been asked that people are curious about for arcade owners is, what games do you have the most issues with? Like, if you can draw to like kind of a category or a specific game that you know of that you have like nightmares about having to fix, just let us know what those games are and
Sure.
why do you think they have issues?
Well, pinball is one of them. Just because it is mechanical, they tend to have a lot of issues, and sometimes they're very difficult to figure out what's wrong. Like right now, I have a Star Trek from Stern that I bought in 2013, and lately it's just been having some bizarre issues where it just starts losing the balls. And I go in and check the switches, because generally the game uses switches to sense where the ball's at or what's going on. But it keeps seeming to forget where the ball is, and the switches are all checking out, and yet it's still losing the ball. So I'm not a pro technician or anything. I call myself maybe intermediate, but that's where I have to consult somebody that knows a bit more about these things to try and figure it out. But I'm far more often buying things for pinball machines than I am for the video games. Now that said, there are some video games which do cause me headaches, and sometimes when you look at them, you're just like, gosh, I want to sell this. At the same time, I almost feel bad, like I don't want to sell somebody else a headache. But sometimes that just happens, whether you want to or not. But let's see, there was Redline Rampage by Global VR, which I had bought as a kit to convert some old Need for Speeds into this somewhat newer game called Redline Rampage, and that's had a lot of strange issues and has required a lot of resets a lot of the time. And so that's one that I wouldn't mind getting rid of, I guess. There was a motion simulator that motion simulators can earn really well when they're working, but when they fail, sometimes they can be a real pain just because they're so massive and it's hard to possibly get to the parts that deal with the motion portion. Now, in recent times, they have been moving away from more complex hydraulic systems, but motion games, they're hit and miss. But they've been moving away from the more hydraulic systems to air bladder systems. Like I think pretty much everything on the market these days that comes from an arcade manufacturer like Raw Thrills or Sega would use these air bladders because they are supposed to be easier to repair and cheaper, which is always nice. It's just like my LA Tig Attack, it did have a bevy of issues, and at this point I've just taken it off the floor and gonna part it out, sell parts if I can. There's not a lot of them out there with a lot of interest in that. But I'm going to see about converting the monitor portion into just some other game. And so, other than that, there's not a ton. I guess the old CRT tube monitors, those can be a pain, just because you do want to, at least as the collector or gamer side of me, wants to try and keep the original tubes going in them as long as I can. But this is something I also talked about recently, was that it's becoming really difficult to find parts for certain monitors. If it's Wells Gardner, then that's usually not a big issue. But Neotech or some rare Wells Gardner monitor models that may have existed back in the day. Like I have a Rampage by Midway, and it uses some strange Wells Gardner model tube in it that when I had a collector guy who works on classics all the time, when he looked at it, he was kind of baffled, and it took him a while to find the parts for it, just because it wasn't a common chassis. And so, I mean, working on those, I become hesitant, just because, well, for one, you need to make sure you properly discharge it so you don't accidentally kill yourself through electrocution. Working on those, and then of course there's a lot of soldering involved. I recently just had to give up on a Virtua Fighter 2 monitor, just because I've replaced almost everything in it except for the tube itself, and it just kept having the same issue. And so it sucks, but eventually, from a business perspective, you have to end up putting an LCD in it instead.
Yeah, I mean, I know the CRTs they're a pain. They definitely can be a pain, and a lot of people talk about having issues with them. I know Kelly, the coder for Galactic Battleground, just bought a bunch of cabinets and moved them, and the CRT was the issue with every single cabinet that he's had an issue with. So it's been small little tweaks, but nothing major. But that's always been the issue. I guess the last question I really have for you is, what advice would you give to a new arcade startup, like someone that's just getting into it? Say they've got a collection of like 20, 30 games, they're ready to start an arcade. What advice would you give to them to get over some of those initial hurdles?
That's a good question. Might be a long answer. I do recommend, kind of what I did was, where I did a business plan, and it did take me a while to go through. Yeah, there were a lot of things that in my business plan I didn't use, but when I went to ask somebody for money, the bank, it showed that I was serious. I remember the guy there, the loan officer, he said, yeah, I've had 25 people come in asking for an SBA loan, but you're the only one that's given me a business plan. And so even though a lot of my numbers, as I learned later, were a bit too rosy, and I was trying not to be too rosy on those, but it was really difficult to get the information on this particular industry, because when you look up a lot of stuff, read stuff about business, they're usually dealing with things like inventory and stuff like that. Whereas in arcade, you don't have that. You have the equipment, which is essentially your inventory, but all this equipment is typically very, very expensive. And lately with inflation, and there was also a big auction that happened, I think it was last year, where the prices were published, and that kind of warped everybody's sense as to what the real value of those games were. It's just caused this perfect storm of prices going up, and shipping as well. And so you want to get a business plan so that you really go through and think about every aspect that you possibly can. It's impossible to anticipate everything, of course, but with a business plan and talking to other operators, if you can reach out to any and getting their advice, that helps. Now, some operators may not be willing to talk to you, especially if they think that you might be opening up in their area and that you might be competition. They may not want to, because they don't want to help out their competitors. But I've gotten a lot of emails and calls over the years from people who are looking to get into the business, and I've been more than happy to help where I can. And of course, there's always a lot of different questions, but also having the capital there. This is a very pricey business to get started into. Now, if you already do have some games, that's great. That's how I started, because I don't come from wealth. And the SBA loan that I got, the most amount that I was able to get was fairly small in a business sense. I think it was like 33,000, which when you're dealing with new games, that doesn't go a very long way. In fact, there's games these days that cost $30,000, or more. But getting as many games as you can before you start up and making sure that they work, and then also having enough capital so that you can operate the business, just because there's a lot of costs that go into this. There's rent, which is usually one of your biggest monthly costs, and I know it might be different if you own the building, but that's not something that most will have to go to another building and lease it out, or a strip mall or a mall, what have you. And I am finding it difficult for arcades like mine to be operating in malls these days, because a lot of investors with a lot of money see malls as great places to build these giant FECs, like happened down the hall from me, because you happen to have a lot of these closed Sears and Mervyn's and other giant ex-giant retailers in their buildings just sitting there, and malls want to do something with them, and so it's become kind of a trend to do entertainment in those. Now, if you do have that kind of capital, then getting into a mall is, like I said, it's something that is a perfectly viable option, because malls are willing to work with you. It's just, if back when I sold games, people would often ask, how much money does it take? I want to open up something like Chuck E. Cheese's, or I want to open up something like Dave and Buster's. Well, what I remember hearing a lot of the time was that Chuck E. Cheese's usually costs somewhere between $2 to $3 million to start, whereas a Dave and Buster's could be between 10 to 15 million. And so, if you do have that money, then yeah, you can make something similar to that work. But if you're like me and you don't, then you can still make things work on a budget. You just have to be sensible about which games you're going to pick and put in there. And so if you can collect anything prior to that, again, like I did, I collected several older games from the 80s and 90s before I started up. It's just for the business model that I wanted to do, which was a kind of a classic mall arcade where I had retro games, brand new games, and some pinball, air hockey, that sort of stuff, your staples, um, all into one. And it was difficult to start out that way, but I was able to survive the economic crash of 2008. Like I literally opened, I think, a month before that all started to come crashing down. But and then just finding things that can set yourself apart. Like if there are any arcades in your area, then you should go to them and see what they're doing, and see if there's anything that you can do better, or see if there's anything that they may not offer. That's one thing that I've done before, is pick up indie games just to offer something else, because it's like no giant FEC is going to buy an indie game except for maybe Killer Queen, but even then I know a lot of them don't have something like that, and that helps stand apart. It's just, unfortunately, indie games are a tough one, just as they aren't going to be competing with The Walking Dead or Maximum 2 in an earnings perspective. And so you do need to be careful about what games you pick. That's where it is wise to get some of those safe bets, some of the light gun games and the driving games, as I've seen many instances where those games are what are carrying some of my weaker games through the day. And now I still do like to have those games. I don't want to just have an arcade full of racing games or an arcade full of light gun games. I personally think that when you go to an arcade, having variety is a boon. I've seen so many people through the years come in and just be looking for one game. Do you have Marvel versus Capcom, or do you have something else. Sometimes you'll get people asking for bizarre, rare games that nobody has, but sometimes there's certain ones that people just kind of expect to see in an arcade. You go to one, you want to see a DDR, a Miss Pac-Man, a Street Fighter 2, that sort of thing. And so those are, of course, our safe bets. But another concept that I've learned over the years that's interesting and helpful is what I call indirect income. And to me, that's kind of what pinball is, and also retro gaming for my situation, is that um, having those games helps bring some people in, and they may just play that game once or twice and then they're satisfied, but then as they look around, then they see something else that they want to play. And so it was the Miss Pac-Man or the Street Fighter or the King of Fighters 98 that brought them in. But now where I have all these other games, this variety, then they're going to go and try that out. And so that's why I still do have retro games and rare games and indie games, even though they're not the most amazing stellar earners for my situation. They're still bringing in income that I can't really track. It's all kind of helping keep the entire ship up. One of the cogs that's keeping the machine running, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I mean, what I'm hearing is be prepared. So have your business plan figured out and
Yeah.
everything. And then have a good variety of new games, classic games, and a mixture of pins, gun games, stuff like that. So you've got a whole bunch of different options. So when people come in, they can play pretty much anything they want.
Yeah, and that's what I like about indie games is just it helps surprise them with
Yep.
something that maybe they've never seen or considered before. It's just I know for any indie developers that might be out there, you have to be careful to not make it too strange or too esoteric or too hard to. It needs to be intuitive still. And an interesting thing that I've discovered in running the Exa Arcadia, which I mentioned in some previous videos with you, was that one game that I got that I didn't really expect much from, uh, called Gimmick Exact Mix. It's a remake of a 1992 NES game that very few people have ever heard of, and but surprisingly, and this surprises the guys at Exa as well. At least last I checked, it's been a while. Uh, it was my number 2 performing game on the Exa platform, behind the Kung Fu versus Karate Champ, a 3D fighting game. And I was perplexed by that because the game, it's obscure, for one. Nobody's ever heard of it, except for very, very few into speedrunning stuff and NES stuff. But your casual person walking in's never heard of it. And it's a very tough game. It's a platformer, kind of like Super Mario, but it requires a bit more skill to it than Super Mario or Sonic the Hedgehog does. And because of that, it's kind of got a little bit of a learning curve. And so I was kind of wondering, it's like, why is it that people keep playing this? And they wouldn't always finish their game, but what is it that drew them in? And it's, I think, the vibrancy, the look of it. It's a very cute looking game. The colors really pop, and just that overall art aesthetic to it. It draws them in. And so if there's anything you can do, like I know a lot of indie developers, sometimes they are the artist and the coder and the sound designer, and that's very tough to wear all those hats. But if there's anything you can do to help the game look different, look stand out, really catch people's attention, and then that works out really well, because it's the arcade is almost like the little candy racks that you have at the grocery store right before right when you're paying for your stuff. They put that there to catch attention and hopefully get another few bucks out of you. And the arcade's like nothing but that. And so you have all these different games calling for attention. And so it can be very easy for a game to get lost in that sea of different titles, different names, most names that people know, and all the flashy lights that especially go into games these days. And so anything that the game can do itself, especially where from an indie perspective, you're generally not dealing with licenses. You're dealing with something that you've created yourself, and so that needs to stand out in such a way that makes people realize that, one, it's a new game. Is that is one issue I've discovered with indie games. Sometimes when you're in an arcade that has games from the 1980s all the way up till now, that an indie game that looks like it was made for 1985 or 82 or whatever, they may just think, oh, this must be an old game in a new cabinet, I guess, and they just kind of walk by because they've never heard of it before. But if it does something on the visuals, the graphics, and maybe even the cabinets, then it can stand out and get those coins.
Yeah, I totally agree. Being able to stand out as an indie game is a very important thing, and
It's tough.
sometimes
I get it. It's not an easy thing to do.
right, and sometimes you want to blend in. Like that's kind of the goal of some games, and some games want to stand out a lot. I guess that's really all I had for you today. So, just shout out your social media so people can follow along with the journey and check out your arcade.
Sure. Yeah, so the blog is arcadeheroes.com, and I'm on pretty much every social media platform out there: Facebook, Twitter, of course. I'm on Instagram, but I always forget to check that. I guess I haven't been big on that just because it doesn't allow you to really share hyperlinks to go back to the blog, but also on LinkedIn, just under my own name. And I've been posting more social stuff to YouTube as well, and I think that's probably the biggest reach. And I've been posting more videos about the industry, inside the industry, and stuff, but also arcade news. And so YouTube is a great place. And then for my own arcade itself, if anybody happens to be watching this that's in Utah, or maybe is going to Utah for a summer vacation or Memorial Day vacation, it's arcadegalactic.com, and also have different social media links on there. And we're in West Valley City, Utah at the Valley Fair Shopping Center. We're inside the mall. We're not the big arcade that's on the outside with the bowling, but we're inside, tucked away near JCPenney. And we're at the Newgate Mall in Ogden, Utah. And we're right next door to Victoria's Secret, kind of a similar situation there. But thank you, Joe. Really appreciate it. And thank you all for watching.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Adam. It's always good to talk and get your insight. Like I said, you have a ton of knowledge on this stuff, so it's always great to hear it. And that wraps it up for this week. So if you're still watching, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We appreciate everyone that follows along. And until next time, peace.
Yeah.